Good evening, everyone. Feel free to find a seat, and if you are still grabbing some tasting samples, feel free to finish that up and then make yourself comfortable. Welcome, my name is Rachel Johnson, and I am a member of the Public Programs Department here at Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. I want to thank you for joining us this evening as we explore the enduring impact of the U.S. Constitution with our special guests, Professor Gerald Torres and Chef Nico Albert. I'd like to begin with our Indigenous peoples acknowledgement. We recognize the museum's role as settlers and guests in the Northwest Arkansas region. We acknowledge the Caddo, Quapaw, and Osage, as well as the many Indigenous caretakers of this land and water. We appreciate the enduring influence of the vibrant, diverse, and contemporary cultures of Indigenous peoples. We are conscious of the role in colonization that museums have played. As cultural institutions, we have a responsibility to engage in the dismantling of historic and systemic invisibility of Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future. We choose to intentionally hold ourselves accountable to appropriate conversation, representation, connection, and education to facilitate a space of measurable change. Tonight's program was inspired by and builds upon the ideas and themes of the exhibition, We the People, the Radical Notion of Democracy. This free exhibition remains open until January 2nd, 2023, and we invite you to join us as we share history and question the themes and ideas through the power of art with this unique exhibition. Tonight's program has been made possible through the generous support of our sponsors and friends of Crystal Bridges. They are identified on the screen behind me. I'd like to extend our gratitude, so please join me in thanking our exhibition and program sponsors. Thank you as well to Arkansas PBS for their partnership in making tonight's program accessible to those tuning in from home and remotely via live stream. We're grateful to have your support on this and our other efforts supporting the exhibition and our mission. Also, thank you to the House of Songs, who have collaborated with us to bring you something special at the end of the talk. And thank you to Chef Nico of Burning Cedar Foods for providing tastings of healthy, traditionally inspired foods provided here tonight. Throughout the talk, if you have a question, we will be collecting them using the QR code on the screen, the one in the upper corner. You can open your camera phone, point it at the screen, and it'll take you directly to an online form where you can submit a question at any time during the conversation, and then they'll take a few questions at the end of the talk. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for the evening. Gerald Torres is a professor of environmental justice at the Yale School of Environment, with a secondary appointment as professor of law at the Law School. A pioneer in the field of environmental law, Torres has spent his entire career examining the intrinsic connections between the environment, agriculture and food systems, and social justice. His research into how race and ethnicity impact environmental policy has been influential in the emergence and evolution of the field of environmental justice. His work also includes the study of conflicts over resource management between Native American tribes, states, and the federal government. Chef Nico Albert, Cherokee Nation, is a self-taught chef, caterer, and student of traditional Indigenous cuisines based in Tulsa, Oklahoma. As the founder and owner of Burning Cedar Indigenous Foods, Nico devotes her time and passion to the revitalization of Indigenous cuisine and promoting healing and wellness in the Native American community by providing healthy, traditionally inspired catering options and educational events. Her efforts to steadily expand her knowledge of traditional ingredients and techniques continue through research and collaboration with Indigenous chefs and traditionalists of all nations. Chef Nico's work has been featured regionally and nationally by Cherokee Nation's OCO TV, Smithsonian National Museum of American History, Atlas Obscura, PBS, Gilcrease Museum, Philbrook Museum, BBC's Harry Bikers, and Food Network, among others. Now, please help me welcome Gerald and Nico to the stage.
in charge of this?
Those are the questions. Before we begin, I'm going to ask Nico to talk a little bit about the food that was served tonight so that you have a sense of what she did.
Yeah, I appreciate you all being adventurous and just eating things that probably look unfamiliar and just diving right in. I hope that you enjoyed the meal. Just to give a little explanation of each dish, beginning with the fact that the entire meal that we enjoyed tonight was made of pre-contact foods, meaning traditional indigenous foods that our ancestors would have eaten before European contact. So the first dish there was a salmon and new potato skewer, and it was seasoned with what I call utet seasoning. In the Cherokee language, utet or uteti is what you would say if something's really delicious. So hopefully it lives up to its name. But it's a mixture of maple sugar, juniper, sumac, and some smoked salt, and a spice called Appalachian allspice, which is a berry that's foraged in this area. It's called the spice bush berry, and it tastes just like allspice, but it's a wild seasoning. So we kind of make our own little proprietary seasoning of that blend that's intended to taste like the forest a little bit. And that was served with a blueberry wojapi, which is a blueberry and actually a little bit of blackberry sauce in there with some chili to spice it up. And then we had some sweet potato tamale bites. So the filling is made with sweet potato that I roasted with, mixed with duck egg and a little bit of blue corn masa from Navajo blue corn, and topped with toasted pinon. And then we followed that with a monomen and mushroom kind of lettuce wrap. We had some little endive leaves there, and the filling was made with sauteed mushrooms, wild rice from the Red Lake Nation Chippewa people up in the Anishinaabe Great Lakes region, and again seasoned with some juniper and maple sugar and sumac, and then seasoned with lots of herbs and jicama in there for a little crunch, served in an endive leaf. And then we had some bison meatballs with a prickly pear barbecue sauce. The bison from that came from the Osage Nation up in Oklahoma, where I'm from. We share space with the Osage Nation, and they actually have their own meat processing facility that came about with the pandemic. They put some of their funds back into their own food sovereignty by creating a space that they could process their own bison herds to keep all of that funding in their own tribal communities. So that's where I get my bison from. And then the sauce was made with some prickly pear and an ancho chili sauce that I make. And then lastly, we had a dip that probably tasted a bit like queso. It had some wild venison from northeastern Oklahoma. I have a couple really good hunter friends that are having a great season. So I am stocked up on venison right now, and you guys are reaping the benefits. So that was a slow roasted cedar braised venison. And then being that all of the food is pre-contact, we have to figure out a way to make cheese without dairy, because I don't know about you guys, but dairy is not my friend. So I try to stay away from it, and we use cashews instead to make a creamy sauce, and then add some chili and a roasted pumpkin that came from the northeast, or from the eastern homeland of the Cherokee people in North Carolina. So we roasted that pumpkin together to make a creamy sauce for the venison. And I think that's everything. Widow, thank you. Hope you enjoyed it.
Well, I'm just hoping y'all didn't finish it, because I haven't eaten that. It does make me want to leave the stage and get down there and eat, I'll tell you what. So thank you for coming tonight. We're celebrating an anniversary of the Constitution. But in order to do that, what I want to do, we're going to have a conversation, and we'll converse for about 35, 40 minutes. Then we'll open up for questions. But I'm going to put a couple of questions on the table for you to think about as we have our conversation. So that we think of the Constitution obviously as kind of the founding document. But what I want you to ask yourself is whether it's the only founding document we ought to think about, whether we ought to consider the other documents that were essentially coextensive with the Constitution, and form the framework that we use and think about as our foundational documents. So let me just give you a couple of examples. So, pre-Constitution, we have the Declaration of Independence. And most people don't think of the Declaration of Independence as a legal document, but of course it is. And it was structured as a legal document. It informs some of the principles that evolved. So I would put the Declaration of Independence as one of our founding documents. And then we have the Articles of Confederation, right, which between the conclusion of the War for Independence and the drafting of the Constitution, which structured the initial relationship between the states, and in fact did something that was really important, right? It helped create something that hadn't existed before, which is federal territory, right, in the land that was beyond the borders of the states, but not claimed by any state, but still thought of as part of the land that was claimed, if not occupied, by the colonial governments. And then there's the Trade and Intercourse Act, which controlled who could buy land in the territories. And finally, there's the Northwest Ordinance, which almost no one thinks about these days, but it's, of course, the statute that controls when a territory is eligible for statehood. And I always think of it when, I don't know if there's any Michigan football fans here, but the fight song for Michigan ends, Champions of the West, which always struck me as a little odd, but it's because the Northwest Territories includes that part of the country. But there's another set of documents that I think we ought to include in the founding documents. And those are the treaties that were signed both by the colonial government before independence, and then the federal government subsequent to the war for independence. In fact, the oldest recognized legal document still enforced in the United States is actually a treaty that was signed in 1722, substantially before independence. And it was the great Haudenosaunee Treaty that resolved a conflict over a murder. But if you study those documents, what you discover in them are different models of governance and different ideas of justice. So when people think about traditional indigenous knowledge, these days most people think about it as kind of environmental knowledge. But in fact, it's much broader than that. It's much broader than that. And so the ideas about justice, the ideas about participation are found in some of these treaties. And I think we ought to include them among the foundational documents that helped create the country we live in. And so, we'll explore some of that. And I'd be happy to talk about it at some length. But the question that I want you to think about as we talk and is, what would you include as the foundational documents that help form the nation we live in? So let's start. I'll start with Nico, and I'll ask her that question.
Well, I mean, you really already mentioned the foundational documents that we identify with, which is each individual tribe's treaties with the federal government. Because as sovereign nations, that's how we identify our existence and space within the United States. So those are, I mean, that's as foundational as it gets, because that kind of outlines how we relate to the United States and our, you know, our existence as sovereign nations within there, how we conduct ourselves and the rights and responsibilities that we have within those of the federal and state governments.
I mean, for example, I just want to give an example. The Cherokee, in the treaties that they entered into with the United States, have a right to have observers in the Congress.
Yes.
Right, so that there's not voting participants, but observers in the Congress. And it's important for people to remember. And one of the reasons I think I'd like to think about treaties and agreements as part of our foundational documents and why they might help us think about how we ought to govern ourselves is that tribes, Indian people, were not contemplated to be part of the political community that was created by the Constitution, which meant they were external to the political nation that was being created. And so the treaties are really important for exactly that. So what is, when you think about treaties, I know a lot of people, you know, you can think about treaties that are violated, but I don't want to think about that right now. What I want to think about is what the spirit of the treaties mean. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind when you bring this up is that I believe a lot of these treaties and a lot of these policies were developed by the federal government with the intention or the forethought that they probably wouldn't be intending to follow through with them or uphold them, because the Indian problem was something that they intended to solve. So to me, when I read these treaties and I look at them, they are legally binding documents. They are foundational documents, and they should be upheld because they were written that way. But I think that when they were written, the intention was probably that this is a temporary thing in the mind of the federal government and, you know, the founding members of that government saying, this is what we're going to promise, with the caveat in their own minds, unspoken, that this wouldn't be a problem for long. But obviously we've proven that to be an incorrect assumption. So a lot of these treaties do have these items, like in the Cherokee Nation Treaty, that we should have a delegate to observe and influence in the federal government in DC, and that would be Ms. Kim Teehee, who is already, you know, on the road to being able to actually sit in Congress and observe and make her opinions known, whether or not she's, you know, not a voting member, but definitely an opinion in the room is an important feature that was included in our treaties. And whether or not anybody thought that they would ever have to own up to that or follow through with it is irrelevant, because it's there and it is legally binding. So those are things that build our nations. You know, we are nation-building people. The Cherokee Nation, you know, one of the first things that we did after removal was reestablish our government, our education systems, our press, to be able to communicate with one another and document everything that was happening to our nation. Those are all things that show that we're, you know, our societies had a lot of merits that they don't get credit for.
Yeah, I want to build on a couple of things that you said, right? Because I think they're important as we contemplate this this question. Right. One is, and it actually started with the land acknowledgement that we began the evening with, and it's important, and I think you underline its importance. Indians are still here. right? The thought was that they would go away. Right? There would be a problem that would be taken care of by one means or another, right? But they didn't, right? And so the continued existence of Native people, right, is a fact, right? And it's a fact even for those places where there aren't, quote, federally recognized tribes. There are Native people in the territory of the United States. So that's one point that I think is important. I really thank you for continuing to raise that. The second is the idea that participation, right, is an important value, even if it doesn't have the power to decide, right? That participation itself is an important thing. So if we think about participation as being a critical value, and how would you go about expanding on that idea in the context of the foundational documents?
I mean, participation as in a way that is separate than, you know, there are so many, I'll back that up. There are, and I forget the actual dates that Indigenous people were granted citizenship of the United States, but it's an interesting situation that we have in this country where our sovereignty was outlined and protected by rule of law, by these treaties, well before we were even able to participate in the federal government or in, you know, vote, own property, anything like that. We had sovereign rights as sovereign nations. So we were citizens of our own nations for hundreds of years before we were given citizenship of the United States, which we were already living within. So that concept of participation is so important because that for many years was the only way that Indigenous people had of being a part of the government that landed on top of us, basically. You know, without having actual citizenship and a right to vote in this country, those sovereign rights that were afforded by the treaties as participants, or, you know, for us to have delegates to at least be in the room when these decisions are being made, whether or not we can actually affect the outcome of decisions because we're not citizens, those sovereign rights are even more important.
I think that's important because the importance of citizenship, right, is well, it's not an unproblematic idea, right? Because it wasn't as if the tribes asked for citizenship. It
was a concept that was outside really of our you know, our worldview until it landed on us.
So citizenship
the idea of
was passed and you were made citizenship. Some resisted citizenship. You know, it remains a live issue, by the way, right? Because the territories in the United States, in fact, there was a case that just went before the Supreme Court, as to whether the members of some of the territories that the United States controls, where the residents are United States nationals, but not United States citizens. Right? So the question of citizenship is actually a problematic question because it does then create competing norms, right? Competing norms. But to what extent should the founding documents, and here I'm counting the treaties primarily, be a counterweight to things that, say, the Constitution might require, right? It's because the Constitution is incumbent on Americans, right? But the treaties predate the Constitution in some cases, and also make some guarantees, right? So how do we resolve that tension? How do we balance the found? I know that's a hard question.
That is. I'm like, well, you know, And I'm not as well versed as you on where those, like, some of those points of contention might be, and I would be very interested if you had some examples of, like, instances where, you know, the Constitution of the United States might be in opposition to some of the treaty laws.
Well, I mean, the classic example, right, is it would be, and you know, the Constitution forbids the establishment of religions, right? So the government can't establish religions. But we know some tribes are theocratic, right? And so the religion is essential to the governing structure. Now, under the Indian Civil Rights Act, that is still permissible, right? But you shouldn't need to be granted permission to that, right? Because it's part of the retained sovereign structure.
That's a great example. And for those that might not be familiar with that, the Indian Civil Rights Act and the Religious Freedom Act basically granted us the right to practice our ceremonies. And that, I want to say, was 1978 that we were given that right, regardless of the fact that, you know, all of our treaties pretty much guaranteed that as sovereign nations we should have had that right all along. But that's that place where the federal law overlaps, and until now, when we're getting into really digging into those treaties and actually starting to respect and acknowledge that sovereignty, saying, well, you know, that never should have required an act to give us religious freedom.
So
to practice our ceremony.
Exactly.
We had that right all along.
Right. It's not something that was granted; it was something that was retained.
Right, retained.
Which is important to. It's an important distinction, I think.
And applies to almost, I mean, basically everything as a foundational document.
Right.
We're talking about rights that we have always had, and they are protected. They were never granted by treaties. They are protected by treaties. They're
Right.
things that we have always had for 10,000 years of living on this land.
So one way then, to get back to the question that I've asked you to think about, right, is the Constitution by its terms is, at least on a theoretical level, a document of enumerated powers, right? That is, Congress can only legislate in areas in which it is given the authority to regulate, right? Treaties ought to be thought of in a similar way, right? That is, they are a barrier to the exercise of congressional or federal authority in the internal affairs of tribal nations, right? And that the point you made, I think, is really important, right? That it's not a right that's granted by the founding documents. The founding documents merely memorialize the boundary, okay, which is an important, I think, a really important point.
Put in writing rights that had been, and practices that had been in place,
right. So let's,
well before the founding of the nation.
So let's take another question about, maybe it might even inform the dinner, okay? A lot of the public land, right, is controlled by the federal government. A lot of that public land, of course, is native land. All of it, you might say.
It's all.
And one of the limitations of the division between it being federal public land and native land is that certain medicines, certain foods are excluded from the kinds of things that native people would normally have gathered or used for their medicines or for their cooking or for their ceremonies. To what extent should there be a recognition that the public land has, in view of the founding documents that we're talking about, that the public land should at least imply the existence of the freedom for nations who have historically used those territories for medicines and foods to continue to gather there?
That's a complicated question, because the concept of land ownership is something that's so directly opposed in our traditional view and relationship with the land. So, my answer would be all of it should be. We should have access to all of our foods and ceremonial medicines, because those were things, rights, and access that was protected by the treaties that we've been talking about. But there comes that overlap again, where private ownership of land or federal ownership of land conflicts with that. So a lot of it is also an issue of us being able to reestablish the culture of stewardship within our own people as well, because it is a relationship that is a responsibility. Our relationship with these plants and animals has been disrupted because of removal, because of colonization. So, it's not something that we could open up tomorrow and say, everyone can go, if you've got your Indian card, you can go and, do whatever you want on this land. It requires a re-education of our own people as well to be able to be the good stewards that our ancestors were.
No, I think that's an incredibly important point. Because one of the casualties, right, of the opening of the West, we'll call it, one of the casualties has been the attempt to suppress native religions, native languages, native traditions, and we're coming to terms with that now as people think about the residential schools. Mm-hmm. And the impact that had on native culture. So that the point you're making, I think, is, and I want you all to think about this in the context of founding documents, is that there's a cultural dimension to the foundational documents as well. And what the foundational documents protect, right, is a space to explore and revivify, mm-hmm. right, those cultural traditions. Right?
Yeah, to reconnect and be able to access those traditions, mm-hmm. because all of our traditions are directly tied to land. Everything, every song that we sing, every medicine that we have, every story that we have is directly tied to land. So access to that land is essential for us to be able to revitalize and preserve and resurrect some of these ways that we've lost. Right. There are a lot of people that are culture keepers that have that connection to the land, but in order for us to expand on that and to ensure that future generations learn that relationship and grow up with that relationship, there has to be access to land. But it's for educational reasons as well, for us to reconnect to it.
Well, which gets me back to one of the questions that I raised right at the beginning, right? When I talked about the kinds of indigenous knowledge, right? People typically, when we talk about indigenous knowledge now, people typically think about it in terms of environmental or ecological knowledge, right? I suggested that there are also kind of indigenous governance models that exist and are found memorialized in some of these foundational documents, but also in the traditions, so that the recapturing and the rebirth of some of these traditions, in fact, also creates the possibility, right, of differing governing models as well, right? I know I probably don't sound excited, but you ought to be excited about it, right? Yeah, think about different ways in which we can govern ourselves. One of the questions, how would you respond to someone who said, well, wait a minute. I'm not Indian, and so I can't go harvest those plants in that national forest. How come you have a special right that allows you to do it?
Do you want the nice answer, or is this the, like, you run into someone in the woods answer?
I just remind you it's on PBS.
Okay, we'll go somewhere in between. No, I think it's something that is an uncomfortable truth that has to be acknowledged, that we, our people have had a relationship and a responsibility to this land for thousands of years, and that needs to be acknowledged and respected. And the ancestral knowledge that we have passed down through generations of how to interact with the land, how to harvest things, when to harvest things, how much to harvest, and how to go about returning that gift that the land gives us, that reciprocity, are teachings that are passed down to us from our ancestors. That's why we have that right and others don't. And I don't think that, I understand that that is an awkward conversation to have, but that's the truth of our existence on this land.
And I want you all to reflect to the kind of the depth of that answer, right? Because what the answer also suggested, right, was that the freedom to harvest, to gather, to use these lands in this particular way is tied not to membership, right, as such, but it's tied to an articulation of the underlying and root and foundational cultural teachings, learnings of the people who are doing it, right? And
which is tied at its core to a very deep responsibility to the land.
Right. So that's actually a window into the kind of participation, right, and restorative justice, right, that the Great Treaty of 1722, in fact, actually talked about, right? So you can go back and look at these documents, and you can look at them, if you look at them, I think, in a way that is open, as opposed to, and look at them as living, breathing documents, right, as opposed to artifacts of a time that has gone by. And you recognize that Native people are still here. Those documents necessarily have to be part of the foundational documents for the world, the nation we live in, right? And what we have to do is we have to think about how do we incorporate them both as legal documents, right, so that they have legal purchase, right? But how do we incorporate them as documents that teach us about how to structure a society in which there are, various definitions of the good, various definitions of the right, various definitions of what things ought to be like, and we have to figure out a way to manage those differences that the treaties themselves respected, and we have to treat the treaties with that kind of respect and demand that they form the foundations for that respect as well. So what I'd like to do now, and
we've got about 15 minutes for questions.
15 minutes for questions. So if there are questions, Nico will can manage them from the iPad. And if if there aren't questions, I'm warning you all, get your questions up here. Because if you don't get your questions up here, we'll just keep yakking. I'm sure you have things that you want answered. And so I don't know if there are any questions yet.
Yeah, not just yet, but as long as this is working correctly.
Well, while you're waiting for questions, what do you want to say that I haven't asked you about?
Okay. Well, I love that you brought up the idea of these differing ideas of what a governmental structure or a societal structure can be, and how sovereignty protects those differences and allows our societies to exist within another, larger system. Because I think it's a great point to bring up that one of the major differences between many indigenous societies' makeups is that we are matrilineal cultures, and that our societal structures often are set up in a much different way than the patriarchy that is the U.S. government. So the rights of our tribes to operate and manage our own societies in that ancient way that we've always known within the system of government that we're within in the federal government is an important distinction to make.
No, I think that's actually a really important point, because the protection of different kinds of governance is actually critical, because you can think, you could imagine, right, rather than being threatened by this, right, you can imagine 547 places where you can experiment, right? 547 federally recognized tribes, each which are capable of running their own affairs in a way that is consistent with the values of those various nations. And we, who are not part of those nations, ought to be able to look and say, look, there are experiments that can happen about governance that we ought to actually prize, right?
This is something that we have started, or that the mainstream culture, a dominant culture, has started to realize, in the same way that when we talk about environmental protections, and now we're starting to look at ancestral ways of knowing for land management, because the fact is that our societies have been living on this land for thousands and thousands of years without the issues that we see today. So we're looking to those ancestral processes to find out how to heal climate change, how to heal our own bodies. That's where my work is looking toward ancestral diets and ways of living with the land that are good for the land and good for ourselves, our longevity. You can look at that in the same way if you look at governance, because we've had these societal structures in our tribes that kept society in line and productive and successful for thousands of years on this land. So the way the federal government is doing it is not the only way there is. There's ways that our tribes have been doing things in our own governance that can be learned from.
Right. No, and the other thing that's important, and we haven't talked about this, is a lot of the tribes and a lot of the treaties have, as part of their subject matter, resource management. Right? And so incorporating tribes into resource decisions that will include states, right? Because the states typically manage the land resources or the water resources. What we need to think about is, how can the resource obligations that grow out of the treaties help inform or help better design resource use or pathways to resource use, or at minimum, free and prior informed consent before resources are used in one way or another.
That's a perfect, actually, segue into one of these questions. One of the questions is, what are your thoughts on traditional foodways that utilize species that are currently endangered? Our way of relating to the natural world and our value systems would say that we do not take resources that are not healthy enough to be taken. We only take what we need, and we only take from plants and animals that are willing and able to give. So if a species is endangered, regardless of what we may need it for, we can't take something that would endanger that species. So in regards to endangered species, there's not an issue of Indigenous people wiping out an endangered species, because knowing that that species is not in a stable enough state to give of itself, we would do everything we can to reestablish that species to the point where we would be able to. An excellent example of that was the American bison, which was almost completely wiped out. We didn't harvest bison when there were only 500 left on the continent. We had to work to bring that species back. Now that species is robust and we are able to eat it this evening, but that we would not be eating it if we hadn't reestablished the species as healthy and strong and able to give us that gift. That's what land stewardship is about, is that relationship. There's also the question, what about US food laws and food processing laws could change to benefit Indigenous societies and the land as a whole? So that kind of speaks to food systems. I don't know if you have commentary on that.
I mean, that's actually a complex question, right? I mean, because the way in which food is managed, right, in the kind of conventional food system, is really, there's two ends, right? One is the production end, right? So how do you control its production, and what things in a non-organic context is permissible to be put on crops? And that's generally tied to the residue in food safety, ultimately, right? But it also can be tied to the safety of the people who are working with the crops. But it hasn't traditionally been tied to the impact, say, on the water resource. So one of the questions you might want to ask is, if you think about conventional productions, you've got to think about how, and here I'm thinking mainly about crops as opposed to livestock, but how crops, we can talk about livestock in a minute, but how crop production is tied to the maintenance and protection of other natural systems. So that's one. Second, for livestock, it's similarly, and the point you made about livestock production is how do you value the livestock as itself, right? As opposed to just being a product that you can manipulate, right, for the value it brings to you, which is that's kind of a complex and not generally agreed upon value, I will say.
Yeah,
right?
It's a sticky point where the entire concept of food as a commodity and as a commercial product is directly in opposition to Native values regarding resources.
Right, exactly. So there's that problem. Now the other side, of course, is the consumer side, which is food safety, marketing, etc. There at minimum, it seems to be the obligation ought to be for truth, right? The minimum obligation ought to be that you tell the truth about the things that you're offering as food. I'm sure people would say, well, that's of course what it does, but of course it doesn't just do that, right? So that's a really simple way of putting the answer, but that's the way I would answer that question.
Another question we have here, let's see, oh my gosh, so many. What other documents do you believe had a big impact on the nation besides the founding documents?
Besides the founding documents, well, the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which is maybe thought of as a founding document. It's a British proclamation, and that controlled the buying and selling of the land west of the Appalachian Ridge. So if you drew a ridge along the Appalachians, it controlled the purchase of that. The rules that permitted land speculation in the federal territories, while not thought of as foundational documents, in fact, of course, had a tremendous impact on claims, right? And it's important to make that point, right? Because there were claims on the land before there was control of the land, right? So that people could say they, quote, owned the land or had a superior legal claim to the land, even if they'd never occupied it and continue to be occupied by Native people, right? So those early transactions are foundational in a material sense, right? But and in some ways, you can't repeal that history from that side, right? And so they're foundational, but in a different way. The other thing you might think of is kind of international treaties that we have that are foundational. Or I like to remind people that the Supreme Court case, and we're about to commemorate its 200th anniversary next year. The Supreme Court case that determined that Native people only held an occupancy right to the land and not an ownership interest to the land was decided almost simultaneously with the proclamation that we think of as the Monroe Doctrine, right? And so I would count the Monroe Doctrine as a kind of foundational moment, because what does it mean to say that we are excluding Britain, or excluding Europe as colonial powers in the Western Hemisphere? Does it also mean then that we are the colonial power in the Western Hemisphere, or at least in this part of North America? So I'd like to think about that as additional foundational documents. The treaties that brought the territories into American jurisdiction are foundational and need to be incorporated into the way we think about governance. So, when I was talking about foundational documents, I was trying to get you to cast your mind back to kind of the earliest days of the Republic. But of course, there are documents that have been enacted or adopted subsequent to that that continue to inform how we think about the Republic. Okay, so.
We're getting short on time, but we have quite a few really good questions here, so I'm just going to keep going. A few things that I can kind of work into one. We've got a question, can I speak to how I learned Indigenous cooking and how pre-contact food is better for us? And how has the language revitalization of the Cherokee youth changed their role in the Indigenous culture? And then also a question that kind of ties into that, a request that we talk about the importance of food sovereignty versus food security. Those all kind of tie together in the fact that the importance of traditional Indigenous food and pre-contact food is that there is obvious superiority as far as the physical vitamins and nutrients and nutritional content of the food itself, but there is also a spiritual and cultural content to it that is necessary for the success and the future of Indigenous nations. So because we are so closely tied to land, we are also closely tied to foods. And all of the foods that we consider to be traditional foods have medicinal values to them at the same time as they have nutritional value. So just like with the revitalization of our language, those things are all integral to our identity as Cherokee people, or, you know, this goes for all tribes across Turtle Island. Each tribe has a way of identifying and having a cultural context for identity that is tied to foods. Our ceremonies, our songs, all tied to seasonality, and they tie to the actual land that is our homelands. So with the revitalization of the Cherokee language, we're able to bring back the perspective that comes only with the Cherokee language. And I say that as I'm not a speaker, I am learning, and I'll probably never be fluent in my lifetime. But we do have this next generation of Cherokee youth that will be completely fluent, that are in these immersion schools. And part of the importance of that is that our language carries a way of looking at and relating to the natural world that does not exist in English. There are relationships that exist in the grammar of our language, the way that we address a type of grass or an animal speaks to our relationship with that and our relationship as stewards of that land. Learning that language is integral and essential to being able to reestablish our relationship with the land and with our foods, and that's essential to healing from the effects of colonization. And, you know, the shorter answer of that is there are all of these issues that we have in Indian country, right? We've got heart disease and diabetes and obesity and hypertension, all of these different things that we worry about and that we want to heal from. And there's also the cultural disconnection issues that we suffer, mental health disorders, high numbers of suicides in our youth. All of those things are the reason that traditional foods are important, because reconnecting to those ancestral foods, they heal our bodies because the nutritional content is better, and they heal our cultural connection because of the spiritual content that comes with them. So all of that is tied together, along with access to land.
With that, I want to thank you all for spending this evening with us. Nico, thank you very much, both for the food and for your insights. Please join us in thanking Nico.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to this next segment of the evening.
Yeah, the next segment of the evening is going to be a little bit of music. We're going to play some blues, but one thing I want to, before we move on to